Hi class, welcome to week 4. This week we're covering chapter 4, which is the world of words. Specifically, we're going to talk about the symbolic nature of language, the principles of verbal communication, symbolic abilities, speech communities, social media and verbal communication, and then some guidelines for improving verbal communication. First, though, we need to start with the symbolic nature of language. So really, words are symbols, which are arbitrary, ambiguous, abstract representations of other phenomena. So, for instance, your name is a symbol that represents you, right? You can be Prince, you can be anything you want. The word house is a symbol that stands for a particular kind of building. Love is a symbol that represents certain intense feelings. All language is symbolic, but not all symbols are language. So art, music, and many nonverbal behaviors are symbolic representations of feelings, thoughts, and experiences. So in order to better understand symbols, we're going to consider 3 characteristics of symbols: arbitrariness, ambiguity, and abstraction. So we're going to start with symbols, and symbols are arbitrary, meaning that the words are not intrinsically connected to what they represent. Okay, so the word book, for example, has no necessary or natural connection to what you might be reading. If you're reading a current bestseller, right, it might not be that. Particular words, such as books, seem right because members of a particular society or social group agree to use them in a particular way, but they have no natural correspondence with their referents. All symbols are arbitrary because we could just as easily use other symbols as long as we all agreed that these certain symbols would refer to certain things. So, this becomes true when we realize that, our words don't mean the same thing in another culture. So think about if you speak another language, right? Sometimes there's not a word that translates exactly for the same thing. Or as, the example in the book, which I actually kind of like, when Dr. Pepper was marketing their soft drink in the United States, if you remember the I'm a pepper, you're a pepper, wouldn't you like to be a pepper too? In the UK, I'm a pepper means I'm a prostitute. And so they couldn't use I'm a pepper, you're a pepper, wouldn't you like to be a pepper too? Because most people would not want to be a pepper too in that instance. Okay? So thinking about, some of that, it's important that we understand that, all word choice is not similar. It all does not mean the same thing. Okay, next, symbols are ambiguous. So they're ambiguous because what they mean isn't clear cut. So the term affordable clothing means different things to different people. If you are making $100,000 a year, your definition of affordable is going to be very different than somebody who is making, $8 an hour. It exists on a continuum. It would be, a connotative word because it doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. Think about, if you travel to different places, right? I live in the Midwest, and so it's pop, right? But in other places, it's soda. In the South, everything's a Coke. So some of that, even though you're ordering the same thing, you're not using the same word to order it. Okay, so then we have to think about that symbols are abstract. So they're not concrete or tangible. So words stand for ideas, people, events, objects, feelings, and so forth, but they're not the things that they represent. So last week in chapter 3, we discussed the process of abstraction, where we move farther and farther away from concrete reality. And so as our symbols become increasingly abstract, the potential for confusion increases. One way this happens is through overgeneralization. Okay, so we make broad statements. You're so negative. But that doesn't really tell us anything. So we can lessen the potential for misunderstanding by using less abstract language. It's clearer to say, I wish you wouldn't interrupt me when I'm talking, than to say, don't be so dominating. Okay, so the other example they give in the book is on Fridays, men don't need to wear ties and women don't need to wear heels versus saying casual dress is okay on Friday. Casual dress is so broad and people took that to mean so many different things. If you think about, the pendulum shift, right, when we went from being super formal in the office as people sort of slowly were allowed to dress more informally, but all of a sudden somehow that meant like tracksuits in the office were acceptable. So the pendulum is slowly shifting back, a little more to the right to be more formal. So they're putting in some of those definitions, being less abstract, saying this is really what that means. Okay. Next, we're going to move on into the principles of verbal communication. So now that we know that language is arbitrary, ambiguous, and abstract, we're now ready to see how this language works. And again, there's 4 principles of verbal communication. Okay. The first is that language and culture reflect each other. So communication reflects cultural history, values, and perspectives. It also creates or reproduces culture by naming and normalizing practices valued by the culture. So calendars name the days that the culture considers important. Think about widely in Western culture, it tends to be Christian holidays that are labeled Christmas, Easter, things like that. Perhaps, depending on where you live, the Jewish holidays might be there too, some of them, but less likely that, Kwanzaa, Ramadan, things like that would be on those. They're just not, for some reason, imprinted, even though the Christian ones are, okay? So the next one that we're going to move to is that the meanings of languages are subjective. So again, because symbols are abstract, ambiguous, and arbitrary, the meanings of the words are never self-evident or absolute. Instead, we construct meanings in the process of interacting with others and through dialogue we carry out in our own heads. So the process of constructing meaning in itself is symbolic because we rely on words to think about what words and other things mean. So words are layered with meaning. The word home, maybe you're going to think about your home. If you use the word children, perhaps you'll think about your children, or you're going to think about little devils, running around screaming, right? Depending on what it is that means to you. Okay, next, language is rule guided. And there's two types of rules, okay? Before we get to them, though, the communication rules are shared understandings of what communication means and what kind of communications are appropriate in particular situations. So we sort of understand that when we're having a conversation, I'm going to talk and then you're going to respond, and this is sort of how we're going to interact. But there's two specific type of rules also. There's regulative rules that specify when, where, and with whom to talk about certain things. So some people have, been told, you don't talk about religion and politics when you go out to eat. We don't talk about these things with, these people, right? Those are the regulative rules. And constitutive rules specify how to interpret and perform different kinds of communications. So this is where we sort of learn, what counts as respect, listening, eye contact, what counts as friendliness, affection. We also learn what kind of communication is expected if we want to be perceived as a good friend, a good employee, things like this. So like regulative rules, constitutive rules are shaped by culture and social groups. And finally, the last one is punctuation shapes meaning. And you go, what do you mean punctuation shapes meaning? I'm talking. How am I going to have any punctuation? I don't put a period there. Right, but there's still, like in the written word, where there's commas, periods, and semicolons to define where ideas stop and start and where pauses are needed. Interpersonal communication, punctuation still defines beginning and endings of interaction episodes. So to punctuate communication, we define when interaction begins and who starts it. When we don't agree on punctuation, misunderstandings may arise. So if you've ever heard children arguing about who started a fight, you understand the importance of punctuation. A common instance of conflicting punctuation is the demand-withdraw pattern, right? So this is where somebody tries to create closeness with personal talk, and the other person wants to have autonomy by avoiding this intimate discussion. And so the more the first person wants to talk, the more the second person sort of withdraws. And it's this circle that never stops, right? I withdraw because you pursue me, and I pursue you more because you keep withdrawing, and I'm withdrawing more because you're pursuing harder, and I pursue because you withdraw. It's just this ongoing, never-ending process. Okay, so there's no objectively correct punctuation. Punctuation depends on the subjective perceptions, but when the communicators don't agree on punctuation, they don't share meanings for what's happening between them, and this is sort of when these negative patterns of communication are formed. Okay, so there's some symbolic abilities we need to talk about. So our ability to use symbols allows us to live in a world of ideas and meanings. Instead of just reacting to our concrete environments, we think about them, and sometimes we transform them. So the first area we're going to talk about is that language defines phenomena. The most basic symbolic ability is definition. We use symbols to define experiences, people, relationships, feelings, and thoughts. Right? And as we saw last week in Chapter 3, the definitions we impose shape what things means to us. So next, language shapes perception. Okay? When we label someone, we focus attention on how particular aspects of that person and their activities, or when we neglect or overlook other aspects. So we might define a person as an environmentalist, right? They might be a teacher. They might be a father. Okay? Each definition directs our attention to certain aspects of the person. So we could talk about, the environmentalist, about certain things about the environment, talk to the teacher about certain things of education, right? Now, there's another aspect in this, the next one, that says language can totalitize. And totalitizing is when we respond to a person as if one label totally represents who they are. And this is, we fix on that to define someone and fail to recognize any other aspects of that person. And parents, you know what I'm talking about here, right? When I go to school, I am Kaylin's mom. I do not exist as anything other than Kaylin's mom. I have no other identity to that, right? And so sometimes we do this with other people too. Some people totalize, gay men and lesbians as if their sexual orientation was the only part of their identities. We don't do this for people that are heterosexual. And so it's not quite the same thing as stereotyping. When we stereotype someone, we define them in terms of the characteristics of a group. But when we totalize them, we negate almost most of who they are just by focusing on the one aspect of their identity. So in my case, I'm Kaylin's mom, right? If you have kids, then you're that person's mom. And finally, language shapes and reflects relationships. The symbols we use to define experiences in our relationship affect how we think and feel about those relationships. So, that means if you are in a relationship, it doesn't just have to be romantic. It could be, friendship. But, when you're using positive language to describe that versus negative language, you tend to have a more satisfying relationship there. Okay, so next, language evaluates. Okay, language isn't neutral or objective. It has lots of meaning in it. So this is an intrinsic quality of language. It's difficult, if not impossible, to find words that are completely neutral or objective. Thus, the particular words that we use shape our perceptions and those of others. Okay, next, language reflects and shapes our perceptions. So we tend to describe people we like with language that accents their good qualities and downplays their flaws. And if we're talking about somebody that we don't like, we tend to use more language that is negative and less that is positive. Language can be loaded. Loaded language refers to words that strongly slant perceptions and meanings. Think about, the terms they give in the book, like geezer and old fogey, incline us to regard older people with contempt or pity. But even I would argue that things like millennials, in some instances, that could be used as loaded language because people are using it in a derogatory manner and, using it to imply that that is a group of people that have these negative qualities to it. So, and that's all based in how we say the word of the language. Okay. Next, language can degrade others. So it can be used to, dehumanize people. Think about, kids, right? Kids on the playground they call each other names, and I'd love to tell you that this goes away as people grow up, but it does not. So especially with the internet and things like that, there's all sorts of hate speech that exists, and people feel much more confident saying awful, nasty things when they feel like they have this anonymity behind the computer than they would say face-to-face. Okay, so it's important to be aware of what it is that we're saying. And it's important to be aware of what it is that we're saying, within our households too, because we say things and other people hear them and then they go out and repeat them. And of course, then that's a direct reflection on us. Okay, next, language organizes perceptions. So we use these symbols to organize our perceptions. As we said last week, we rely on cognitive schemata to classify and evaluate experiences. So how we organize experiences affects what they mean to us. So language allows for abstract thought. Language can stereotype, as we've talked about. Language also allows for hypothetical thought. So we're allowed to think about, the past, the present, and the future, which is really an incredible thing. Okay, so we can think beyond just immediate concrete situations, and we live in these 3 dimensions of time. Finally, we live in we can foster personal growth by thinking hypothetically. It helps us to grow personally. This doesn't just have to be in academic settings. I can't think of a better word than that, right? But, when we think hypothetically about things, even if it's that you're replaying a situation in your head about how you would have handled something differently, when you finally have that retort that you would have said to somebody, it helps you to critically examine, what went wrong in that situation and how you could improve that the next time around, okay? So language also allows for self-reflection. So just as we use language to reflect what goes on outside of us, we can also use it to reflect what's going on inside of us. Okay, so there's two sides to the self. First, there's the I, which is the spontaneous creative self. This is the one that acts impulsively in response to the inner needs and desires, regardless of the social norms. And then there's the me, which is the socially conscious part of the self that monitors and moderates the I's impulses. So the me reflects on the I from the social perspective of others. The I is impervious to the social conventions and expectations, but the me is keenly aware of them. Okay, so this is where in an argument your I may want to hurl a biting insult at someone that you don't like, but the me says, no, we can't do that, and you have to sort of tramp that down a little bit. Okay, so we also can learn to monitor our communication. So self-reflection allows us, the ability to empower ourselves to monitor what we say and how we say it, and it also allows us to manage our image. As we talked about in Chapter 2, we want to put forward a particular face in our interpersonal encounters. And because we can reflect on ourselves from others' perspective, we're then able to adapt our communication so that we appear positively in their eyes. Okay, next we're going to talk about speech communities. And a speech community exists when people share norms about how to use talk and what purpose it serves. And there's a lot of different speech communities, right? And these are defined by shared understandings of how to communicate rather than countries or geographic locations. So some of these happen online, some of them do happen in communities, but there's gendered speech communities that you can look at in your book that give you more information of them. But it's interesting to look into the things that happen in them because there's different socialization, there's different gendered communication, and there's different misunderstandings that take place there. And it's interesting to see how these speech communities are formed and then the role that they play in other areas. Okay, and of course, as always, social media plays a role in our verbal communication because social media gives rise to new words. Okay, buddy list, instant messaging, netiquette, cyberbullying, chat room, all of these are sort of derived from being online, and they didn't exist 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so it's a new vocabulary, it's a new way to think about how do we interact. There are whole relationships that exist solely online, and that's a new dimension of interpersonal communication that, we never had to consider back, when I was a kid, right? Because none of this stuff existed then, okay? And there's also rules governing verbal communication. There's, again, those regulative and constitutive rules that still apply that we talked about. So how do we improve our verbal communication? Well, the first is to engage in dual perspective, right? And we've talked about this. And this is to understand what other people are saying and to not just look at everything from our own perspective. So respect what others say about their feelings and thoughts. And some of that is to also own your own feelings and thoughts. Has anybody ever said to you, you do this to me? And you think, well, that's not really true, right? Effective communicators take responsibility for themselves by using language that owns their thoughts and feelings. And this is the I language versus the you language. So you language is you make me nervous on the job. I language is when you watch me work, I feel nervous. I have to say this to my husband all the time because I can't pull our car into the garage. I always end up knocking over. We have one of those stop things that says stop here. And I don't know why. I always knock it over. And when he's in the car, it makes me even more nervous. And I have to say, when you watch me or you say things, it makes me really nervous. It still makes me nervous, even though I've told him. But he at least knows that now, right? Okay, so next we have to respect what other people say. So when we say you shouldn't feel that way, when somebody tells us that, we think, well, no, I'm allowed to feel this way. So we have to make sure that, we're respecting how others feel as well. We need to strive for accuracy and clarity. Okay, so be aware of our levels of abstraction. Remember, as we talked about, misunderstanding is less likely when we're conscious of the levels of abstraction. When it's very general, then people tend to misunderstand it. So we should make sure that we're qualifying the language if we need to. That brings us to this week's assignment, which is on perception and communication. So it says in Chapter 3, the book stated that there's no intrinsic meaning in phenomena, but that humans actively construct meanings and attach values. So this week then in Chapter 4, the book argued that language is powerful and that values are inherent in the words we use and shape our perceptions and those of others. Do these two statements contradict one another? Craft your answer in relation to the notions of the hate speech and loaded language. Be sure to distinguish between these two notions in your answer and provide concrete examples to support your point. Provide an example of a situation you encountered with hate speech or loaded language. How did that make you feel? Your paper should be 1 to 2 pages, citing specific examples and providing a detailed analysis, incorporating reading and textbook materials. If you use outside sources, please be sure you cite them properly. There's also a discussion board, and your midterm is this week. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to your instructor. Have a great day.